Hello there my friends, and welcome back to JJ Painting. I am JJ, and today we are going to be talking a bit more about the Astra Militarum, or Imperial Guard, depending on who you ask. So as you may remember from my last video, we were talking a little bit about where they are and how they got there and what they used to be, and all about their history and a little bit about where they are now and why they seem to have fallen by the wayside a little bit in the last few years. But today we're going to talk about the future, so here's a bit of speculation on what I think they need, and hopefully what we will start to see them getting in the next codex or so. And to continue the legacy of painting guardsmen, we're going to paint this model right here, this officer. Yes, KD does indeed stand, or at least it stands when I'm painting these models, otherwise they are lying down in a case somewhere. Anyway, without further ado, let's crack on. Let's start by saying that I'm going to be making comparisons to other armies. Now, I don't mean that we're going to be borrowing things wholesale from things like Drukhari or Orcs or Space Marines, but there are certain things which now run through every army that are very similar, and those are the sorts of things that I will be referring to in this video. So with that said, the first thing I want to say is the Imperial Guard, Astra Militarum, need an army-wide special rule. So this is something similar to the power from pain ability that the Drukhari have, Here We Go and Daka Daka for Orcs, and the many rules that now come under the bracket of Angels of Death that all Space Marines have access to. In that regard, I think Imperial Guard are quite lacking, and they do need something equivalent. Now, they do technically have something like that in the form of the grinding advance rule for Leman Russes. However, this does of course only apply to Leman Russes and doesn't actually apply to things like infantry or other vehicles like the Baneblades or the Chimeras or the artillery pieces. One of the biggest challenges for Games Workshop naturally is going to be finding a special rule that does sit comfortably across the entire range, that works as well for infantry squads as it does for sentinels, as well for scout sentinels as it does for Leman Russes and super heavies and so on and so forth. The separation of things like Valkyries and the auxilia of Ratlings and Ogrins away from the regiments does help this, I think, a little bit, because obviously they're very particular units and I think they were right to keep them separate. However, for the things that do form the core of the Imperial Guard army, and having it as an army-wide special rule, I do think they're going to need that, and they're going to need it quite soon in order for them to have something that they can hold on to and say, this is uniquely Astra Militarum. If we do look at other armies briefly, it does give the feel that the lore has a bigger impact and influence on the game than it has in previous editions. Again, if we talk about Daka Daka for Orcs and Here We Go for Orcs, or even any of the Angels of Death special rules, such as Shock Assault or Bolter Volley, all those things are actually really interesting and present themselves in most of the books and most of the backstory, and it's nice to actually see them have some presence in the game for once. Now, for what this could mean for Astra Militarum is any number of things, obviously, but I think if we start with that, then we'll start to see a bit more of a hook and an appeal for the Astra Militarum army as a whole, rather than having just to purely rely on what they may or may not have on their stat lines or in their regimental traits. And this, incidentally, brings me on to my next point, a overhaul of the Astra Militarum regiment system. Now, if we look at the regimental system for the Astra Militarum, they're obviously a little bit behind everyone else because they now have a slightly older codex, although in this edition that doesn't mean much because it's only 3 years old. But with that said, their regimental traits, I believe the emphasis for them shouldn't be on the established ones, such as Vostroyans, Cadians, Katachans, Valhallans, etc. I believe firmly that they should be emphasised on the custom ones. If we look at the difference between the Astra Militarum and, say, for example, the Space Marines, all the Space Marine chapters are allegedly, anyway, hearkening from the first founding Loyalist 9 legions. And even if you look at these successor chapters, as much as they are fantastic, a lot of them do draw certain things from the first founding chapters. However, unlike the Space Marines, the Astra Militarum aren't limited to the same way of doing things. They have combat doctrines that they do stick to, yes, but because the Astra Militarum is meant to be the most diverse army in the Imperium, that could be reflected far more in their playstyle, because we're not just talking about combat doctrines, we're also talking about cultures, we're talking about access to resources, so this is where we start to talk about specialisms and specialization. And for the Astra Militarum, for an army that broad, as the Codex stands at the moment, they don't really have a lot of that. If you have actually looked at the Codex recently, one of the things that will stand out is that there's not a huge amount of difference between an all-infantry army and the benefits of that, or a mostly tank army and the benefits of that. The only way those two begin to intersect is in the order system. And this brings me on to my next point. The orders system, I think, needs a complete and utter overhaul. The orders themselves are quite nice, and I remember when the order system first came in about 10, 11 years ago. I know this is very much a back in my day moment, but I think it's worth saying. When the orders came in, they were a really nice idea. They've evolved a little bit over the years, and I do still think that the concept of them has a place in the game. However, what was a good idea 10 years ago doesn't necessarily translate to being a good idea now. If we look at the specifics of the orders, many of the orders are either stratagems or aura abilities that other armies have on their characters. Now, as a result of this, it does mean that those abilities are far more staple and actually far more reliable because they are just a passive buff to the army. They don't necessarily need to be used as a special ability. And where they are a stratagem, they often come with the fact that they can be put just about anywhere or onto any unit. And where they are unit specific, then it's specific enough to that unit that it doesn't feel like the rest of the army is losing out. However, with the Astra Militarum orders ability, because it's only officers and kind of commissars with certain warlord traits, but that doesn't really matter for this, it does very much feel like you're limited in terms of the accessibility and use you have. You can have lots of officers if you want, but then again, that means you have to have lots of officers to get these benefits, which other armies elsewhere don't have to take as many units to get. They are just buffs, or they are just abilities, as I say. But as a result, it does mean that I think what the orders are meant to be needs to change. And this is where we ask ourselves the question, is the order system just meant to be so that the Astra Militarum can fairly have access to certain buffs? Some of the orders, such as first rank fire, second rank fire, do make sense, because obviously a buff that just gives every lasman an extra shot is a little bit iffy. But on the other hand, other things such as move, which is just a stratagem, or bring it down, which does have some benefits to bringing down large vehicles, does make a bit of sense, but that's the sort of thing which you can make a stratagem. And obviously that means that to have that ability, you do still need to have an officer close enough to that unit to get it off. So what I'm really asking is, what are the officers doing that makes them that important? And what are the officers bringing with the orders themselves that make it that unique? I'm not entirely sure exactly what the answer is, because I don't feel it's particularly straightforward, but I do definitely think that in terms of what we're getting at the moment, those officers could have a lot of those orders as passive buffs, especially things like the company commander, and it wouldn't actually make that much of a difference to the game or to how the Astra Militarum are played. And then, of course, when you have things like regimental special orders, those things are a nice idea in principle, but they do raise the question as to why would an order specifically be for one regiment and not for another one, especially when we look at those orders currently. They don't massively change the overall style of play for those armies. Talon, Vostroyan and Katachan are all very good examples of this. I'm not going to rattle off their orders here, but it's worth looking at. If you look at them, there's nothing really any of those orders do to those regiments that wouldn't make any difference if they were on Cadians or Stormtroopers or Valhallans. So that's something else to bear in mind. And this is one of the unfortunate things, is that that's why, in some respects, the army as a whole can feel a little bit more homogenized, and the distinctions you would like to get within those regiments just simply isn't there. But this is one of the other things that I think is worth mentioning, and this is where we're going to talk very specifically about the model range at the moment. And that quite simply is, it needs an overhaul, and I don't think that's particularly controversial. Now, in my previous video, when we talked about the Astra Militarum, I did say that things such as tanks and the aircraft, and arguably the stormtroopers, were the ones that were getting most of the attention because they were a little bit more homogenized and a bit more ubiquitous across all of the Guard regiments. So a Leman Russ for a Katachan would be the same Leman Russ as if it was for the Vostroyans, or the Valhallans, or the Death Corps of Krieg. However, this very much came at the expense of the infantry ranges, which is, as I said, why Valhallans and Talon and Mordians have very much felt left behind. Arguably, even the Katachan boxes have started to show their age a little bit. And I'd even say that the Cadians haven't really been able to get out of it entirely unscathed, because Cadians are starting to look a little bit dated themselves. So the real thing for most people, and this isn't controversial, is that they do need to overhaul the range so that we can have that uniquely diverse and that rich feeling that the Imperium is bigger than just Cadia. Or Games Workshop could double down, and they say that if you are in the Astra Militarum, you now have to wear this, and that in itself would make a bit of sense story-wise, even if the overall conversions might take a bit of a hit, or people would have to convert their armies if they want them to have that unique feel. I know at the moment there are third-party companies that do provide certain kits that are able to either upgrade or completely replace entire Astra Militarum armies, especially for the infantry range, but I feel like that doesn't really help the situation because they are still expensive. I know people have talked about the idea of having a modular kit that would allow you to customize and chop and change your guardsmen. And I think if we look over at things like the Necromunda hive gangs and some of the underhive gangs, and a lot of the specialist games, we are starting to see certain things in plastic that would lend themselves to that, but we've not seen anything that they've directly said, this is Astra Militarum, here is how they're going to look going forward. But I also think, on this note, there is a quantity issue as well. Again, going back about 10 years, you would probably be able to pick up a squad of 20 guardsmen for about the same price as a tactical squad. Now, obviously, 20 models at 1 wound, but light infantry, and being the same price as 10 heavy infantry, super soldiers, with 10 wounds is one thing. But if we look at the current situation, and this has been especially exacerbated in the last couple of years, now that Space Marines have 2 wounds and Primaris have been released, is that your guard squad of £22 is 10 models with 10 wounds, whilst your £30 tactical squad is 10 models with 20 wounds between them. So there's a definite disparity in terms of what everyone's getting. And that is a really big problem, especially if you're now coming into Astra Militarum. If you were playing Astra Militarum a few years ago, it wouldn't matter that much, but now it probably really does. And if we do look over to Age of Sigmar, we can prove that having boxes with more than 10 models in it can be done. Dryads, Kyrek Acolytes, and a handful of other boxes have all shown that you can get 10 plus models in one box. And even though, yes, they are probably going to be used as one unit rather than multiple units, I really do believe that that's going to have to be the way forward for Guard again, because it worked better for them in the past than I believe it does now. And it's an easier way for new players to get into it. And ultimately, it does actually help expand the Astra Militarum capability of fielding both armies of certain sizes. And it means that us as players don't have to put in more money than a Space Marine player would have to get their basic number of troops. I will say one thing, is that since they have gotten rid of the platoon system, it has made actually getting hold of enough guardsmen to play a decent game with a lot easier. You no longer have to get 40 guardsmen at nearly 80 quid to cover your 2 troop choices, unlike a Space Marine who needs to spend about £40 to cover their 2 troop choices. So there has been some improvement in that respect. But then this brings me on to my next point, and this is a tricky one. Zooming out slightly, is that the Astra Militarum, most players look at them very much as, are you going to go infantry heavy or are you going to go tank heavy? Now, I feel that because a lot of the imagination and original impetus of the Astra Militarum still sits quite firmly in World War II, and the way armies and tactics and the forces were organised. So I think moving away from that now is probably going to be one of the bigger challenges, but if they want to keep that World War II aesthetic and inspiration, that can still work. But there needs to be a bit more benefit to it. So if we're talking about having large infantry armies, what's the benefit of having mostly infantry? If you're having mostly tank armies, what is the benefit of having mostly tank armies? And what I'm not talking about at the moment is the current thing for the tank battalions where they have objectives secured, because whilst that's a nice idea, I don't necessarily think that is enough, nor is having tank orders. And again, the tank orders, like the previous orders, I think they need to have a bit more to them, because at the moment they are still just things that other armies have as auras or as stratagems. The orders themselves aren't doing enough to hold up the army on its own. So that's what I think the issues are for the Astra Militarum and what they need next. I think one of the biggest questions is going to be how that's going to manifest itself, and wondering what exactly we'll be looking at when it comes around to it. But what I want to do is actually ask you guys, what do you think the Astra Militarum need? What do you think they need to bring themselves into a slightly more interesting plane of existence alongside other armies? Do you agree with what I've said about the Astra Militarum, what they need? Do you disagree? Do you think there's more things they need? And do you think they need them more urgently? Let me know your thoughts. I look forward to hearing from you. There we go. So those are my thoughts on the Astra Militarum and what they need next. So, like I said in the video, let me know your thoughts. Let me know what you think. If you think they need more, if you think they need less, if you agree with what I said, then, you know, please comment below. Let me know what you guys think the Astra Militarum need, because as always, I'm interested to hear your thoughts. But until next time, I will say thank you very much for watching. I try to post now every Wednesday and Friday, so, you know, as always, like, subscribe, hit that bell button, or just check back here on Wednesdays and Fridays if that's more your jam. Then I'm more than happy with that. But in any case, thank you very much for watching, goodbye, and have a lovely day.